Hey everybody, it's Vicar Luke here with New Hope Lutheran Church, continuing our Bible study in the Gospel according to St. Luke. Today I actually get the blessing to be up here at one of my favorite places in the whole wide world, and that is Camp Lynn Haven. It's actually pretty cool. I helped build the fireplace the fire pit behind me when I was a kid. I grew up here and I love this place. It's a kind of my home away from home. And so Danny and I were able to make it up today for a few hours to see some family and some extended family that we don't get to see very often. And I was able to sneak away and come to my favorite campsite here at camp and enjoy the beautiful scenery and God's amazing creation. So I'm very happy to be up here, very happy to continue our study in the Gospel according to St. Luke. Today we will be diving in to the story of Jesus healing or raising the widow's son from the dead. So we're in Luke chapter 7. We're going to start at verse 11 and go to verse 17. And the Word of God says this: So afterwards, he went to a town called Naum, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew to the gate near the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, Do not weep. Then he came up and said, Young man. He came up and touched the bearer, and said to the bearers, and the bearers stood still. And he said, Young man, I say to you, arise. And the dead man sat up, and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people. And this report about him went about and spread through the whole of Judea and the surrounding country. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. So let's dive into this amazing story. So as we start here, at verse 11, and it says that he came into this town, and this brings emphasis to the moment and what is about to happen. So this starts to lead up to this great moment, and it also speaks again to the large crowds that traveled with Jesus. He wasn't alone. Instead, he had his disciples, and he had the large crowd that we've talked about in the past videos. So he comes with this large crowd, and as he approaches, he sees a funeral. As they drew near the city gates, they were carrying the body outside of the city gates. This is where they would go to bury the bodies outside of town. They didn't have cemeteries in town like we oftentimes do today. They kept them all out of the city gates. And so this was the only son of a widow woman. And this would have given this widow woman quite a desperate status, because in this society, women were not supposed to be alone. And so your husband took care of you while your husband was alive, and then when he passed away, your son took care of you. But this woman had no husband any longer because he had passed, and now she had no son. And so her status as a citizen in this town would have been second rate. She would have not been taken care of, or would have been more than likely a needy woman due to not having a male in her life to support her and to take care of her. And so this would have brought her kind of a shame, not a shameful status, but would have brought her as a second rate, more or less, status in the town, because she would have never had anyone to look over her any longer. So the very fact that Jesus took note of her kind of stands out of importance too, because like I said, this woman was a nobody. She wouldn't have had that status in town any longer. So when he sees her, not only does he take notice of her, but it says here that he has compassion on her. Now, this word compassion is pretty interesting, because in the English, it's not that important of a word. Compassion, okay, you can have compassion on somebody, that's fine. But in the Greek, this is a very beautiful word, and it is a lot more imagery to it. And it actually means that his guts, his insides, spilt out for this woman. It's a very graphic word in the Greek, and it translated, it really means an outpouring of the inward parts. So Jesus felt the grief and the pain that this woman had felt within his very own body. He had that compassion for her, was that inward pain, that grief that this woman was feeling. Jesus felt that as well. He felt the pain of this woman. And so to have compassion on somebody is to truly feel what they feel deep down inside. And that is also the first time in Luke's gospel that the narrator, Luke, actually calls Jesus Lord, is in this verse. In verse 13 is the first time he calls Jesus Lord himself in his gospel. So that's just an interesting fact about Luke's gospel as well. And so he has this compassion for her, and he gives her this command. He says, do not go on weeping, or as the ESV says, do not weep. Well, that's an interesting command to give to somebody who's grieving, to look at them and say, hey, why are you, just stop grieving? Well, that's impossible. How are you going to just stop grieving, right? When you have pain like that, that's just an odd thing to say to somebody who is in grief and who is in pain, especially somebody you have compassion for. But this command that Jesus gives her is a start to the beautiful miracle that comes. So he says, do not weep. Do not go on weeping. And it's at this time that the miracle that Jesus is about to bring forth is starting. So if you can imagine what it would be like to have a stranger come up to you at your child's funeral and tell you to no longer weep. I mean, that right there would be strange by itself. But what's about to happen is even more strange. So Jesus goes up and he places his hand upon the casket. Now, this would have caused everyone to just stop in their place. To see a stranger, for one, go up to the widow of a woman who's just burying her son and says, hey, do not weep, and then walk up to the person's casket and lay his hand on the casket. This would have stopped everybody in the town, everybody in the crowd. They would have looked at him and they would have gasped. This is very scandalous, because in Jewish society, you would not touch a dead body. You would not touch a dead person's casket, because that would make you ceremonially unclean. And so for him to go up and touch this would have made him ceremonially unclean. That would have been a big no-no. You don't do that. And yet he goes up to the woman, he says, do not weep. And the second strange thing he does is he goes and he lays his hand upon the casket. And so he lays his hand upon the casket, and this was, like I said, this was a big deal. And then he calls out and he says, young man, be raised up. And that's more of a literal translation. Another translation is, young man, I say to you, arise. That's the ESV. It says, young man, I say to you, arise. Okay, so that's three things in a row Jesus has done that's been strange. First, he tells a mother who's at her own son's funeral, stop weeping. Second, he touches a dead body, which is ceremonially is just a no-no. You would not do that in Jewish society. And the third thing he does is he says, young man, I say to you, arise. Three things in a row he does that are strange, that are odd, that don't make sense. And the next thing you know, what does it say? It says, and the dead man sat up and began to speak. Wow, I'm just telling you, that's amazing. That's beautiful stuff. Because not only did Jesus raise a dead man, but he gave this woman status again. And not only did he give her status, he gave her hope, and he gave her her son. Her only son he gave back to her. Not even death kept them apart. And that is a beautiful thing to see, and an amazing, amazing story to hear. And so the Word of God speaks into the life of what was dead, and the young man sat up and he spoke and was given to his mother. I mean, this account not only shows the full power of Jesus as he walked, but it also shows the compassion, the love, and what Jesus came here to do, and that was to defeat death. He came to defeat death. This is a very much a prophetic text, as far as this shows Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecy, as the fulfillment of the prophets. This was the last thing Jesus needed to do to be a prophet, to raise someone from the dead. And as we look in the Old Testament, we see many of the prophets performed a miracle such like this one, where they raised people from the dead. And so this was, to be a great prophet, this was one of the last things Jesus needed to do, and that's what he does here. He raises this young man from the dead, and they say, a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. So that is amazing stuff. And an interesting thing here I'd like to point out about this miracle and what happens here is, you notice you don't actually see the word faith. It doesn't talk about the young man's faith that he had before he died. It doesn't talk about the mother's faith. She doesn't. It's not like the story we heard last week, or 2 weeks ago now, about the centurion who showed this great faith in sending his servants to ask the Lord to just speak his word to heal his servant, right? Well, that's not what we see here. Faith is actually not mentioned, and so it's interesting, but it points us to this fact. It points us to the fact that it is not the faith that raised this man from the dead. Rather, it is the word of the Lord spoken over him that has done this. You see, it was done out of Jesus' own power, his own compassion, his own word that raised this man from the dead. Not anything that the woman showed, not anything the woman did, but the word of God solely is what raised this man from the dead. And this miracle, it points to, like I said, what Jesus has come here to do. It points to Jesus being the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies and ultimately the last prophet and the Messiah. And the prophet greater than Moses who has come. And so it's a pretty amazing stuff. And it's also a foreshadowing of another time in Luke's gospel where Jesus is going to raise someone from the dead, but also the ultimate raising of the dead, which Jesus does himself when he is raised on the third day, defeating death, defeating sin, and defeating the devil. So that is Jesus and the widow's son, the raising of the widow's son in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Well, I look forward to jumping in next week back into Luke's gospel, and I'm glad that you were able to join us. I hope you enjoyed the view. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. I don't know. But either way, thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again next week. Remember, you are loved. You are a baptized child of God, and you are forgiven. God bless us.